It starts as a quiet blessing. You notice things others don't. A subtle shift in someone's tone, a contradiction in their words, the way people pretend to be fine when they're not. You catch patterns, small details, silent truths that most overlook. At first, it feels powerful. You tell yourself, it means you're awake while the world sleeps. But as time goes on, that same awareness begins to ache. You can't unsee the cracks in everything. You can't return to the comfort of ignorance. And slowly, the gift turns into a curse you never asked for. The intelligent mind doesn't just think, it observes, dissects, and questions endlessly. You start to realize that awareness isn't peace. It's a constant confrontation with things most people are protected from. When others can laugh, you're analyzing the meaning behind the laughter. When others find comfort in routines, you see the futility in repetition. The more you understand the world, the harder it becomes to rest in it. Intelligence, by its nature, strips away illusions. And most illusions are what make life bearable. There's a strange kind of loneliness that comes with clarity. It's not about being physically alone, but feeling emotionally misplaced. You could be surrounded by people, yet there's a quiet distance between their conversations and your thoughts. You nod, you smile, but deep down you feel unseen. The world values productivity, noise, and certainty. But intelligent minds often dwell in silence, hesitation, and doubt. That mismatch creates an invisible wall. You stop trying to explain yourself because you've learned that most people don't want truth, they want reassurance. Over time, thinking becomes less of a choice and more of a reflex. You don't mean to overanalyze, but your mind won't stop spinning. You replay conversations, dissect motives, calculate possibilities. You see multiple sides of every story, yet that wisdom offers no comfort. It only paralyzes you. You envy those who can just act, who can speak without self-editing, who can believe without questioning. Meanwhile, you're caught in loops of reflection that never resolve. It's exhausting to live inside a brain that never stops interrogating reality. Awareness is often mistaken for freedom, but it's rarely that simple. The more you see, the more weight you carry. You see the patterns of human behavior, the predictability of suffering, the endless cycles of desire and disappointment. You see how history repeats, not because people forget, but because they never truly change. You see manipulation hidden behind kindness, fear masked as ambition, love tangled with control. It's a heavy thing to understand so much and still have to live among illusions you can't unsee. And yet, there's beauty in that pain. The intelligent mind feels deeply, not because it wants to, but because it can't help but notice the fragile threads that connect everything. You see meaning in chaos, poetry in pain, lessons in loneliness. You start to sense that maybe this burden exists for a reason, that those who see too much are meant to carry perspective, not bitterness. Still, it's hard to hold that awareness every day. It wears you down, makes you quiet, and sometimes even cynical. But beneath that cynicism, there's still a yearning for something pure, something real enough to justify the pain of seeing. People assume intelligence makes life easier. They think it helps you solve problems, avoid mistakes, control outcomes. But the truth is the opposite. The more you know, the more uncertain you become. Every decision opens more possibilities. Every belief feels fragile. The comfort of certainty fades, replaced by endless questions. You start to envy those who live simply, who find joy in small things, who don't need every answer to make sense. Intelligence gives you insight, but it also robs you of peace. Sometimes you wish you could turn it off. You wish you could stop noticing, stop feeling, stop dissecting the world like a puzzle. You long for the kind of ignorance that allows others to laugh freely. But you can't go back. Once your eyes open, they never close again. You're condemned to see through the surface of things, to feel the undercurrent of everything. It's not arrogance. It's just awareness that refuses to sleep. And though it isolates you, it also makes you deeply human. Because suffering, in its own strange way, becomes proof that you care. You begin to understand that intelligence doesn't make you superior. It makes you sensitive. It makes you aware of pain, both yours and others. It teaches you that understanding doesn't always heal. Sometimes it deepens the wound, but it also opens a doorway to compassion. When you truly see how fragile people are, how confused and scared everyone secretly feels, your anger softens. You stop judging and start empathizing. You realize that everyone is fighting to protect their illusions because reality, when seen too clearly, is terrifying. And maybe that's the quiet purpose of intelligence, not to dominate, not to outthink others, but to understand them, to feel their confusion and still love them, to see the world's flaws and still choose kindness. The pain of intelligence isn't something to escape, it's something to integrate. It's the cost of seeing clearly in a world built on comfort and denial. And once you accept that, something shifts. You stop wishing to be understood and start appreciating the rare peace that comes from understanding. So you live with it, the burden of seeing too much. You carry it quietly, like a secret you no longer resent. You start to notice that beneath all the chaos, life still has moments of stillness. A soft sunset, a genuine laugh, a fleeting silence between thoughts. Those moments remind you that maybe intelligence isn't here to make you happy, but to make you aware of beauty even in suffering. And that awareness, though heavy, is sacred. Maybe that's the paradox. Intelligence hurts because it forces you to feel life in full. The joy, the pain, the absurdity, the truth. It strips away comfort, but in return, it gives you depth. You lose innocence, but you gain perspective. You lose belonging, but you find authenticity. And somewhere in that quiet trade, the pain begins to mean something. You start to realize that the burden of seeing too much isn't a punishment. It's an invitation to live more consciously, even when it hurts. The mind that sees too much becomes its own universe. It doesn't rest easily because it's always scanning, connecting, decoding, and interpreting everything that passes through it. Most people live on the surface of things, satisfied with appearances, but an overaware mind dives beneath them instinctively. It finds patterns where others see randomness, motives behind gestures, and meanings behind silence. But every insight comes with a cost, emotional fatigue. When you recognize too much of what lies beneath human behavior, you stop being surprised. You start predicting disappointment before it even arrives. You see through charm, through confidence, through performance, and it makes connection feel hollow. The same intelligence that once felt like a gift now feels like a weight pressing down on every thought. Pattern recognition is both brilliance and burden. You notice small inconsistencies that others overlook, like a tremor in someone's voice or the way they avoid eye contact when lying. But these details don't bring peace, they bring tension. Because when you see everything, you can't ignore anything. Your brain becomes a constant detective, chasing meaning even in meaningless moments. Over time, this habit rewires you. You stop living and start analyzing. Every experience becomes data, every emotion a problem to be solved. You don't feel life, you study it. And the more you study, the further you drift from the simplicity of just being. Then comes meta-thinking, the second layer of awareness that watches even your own thoughts. You don't just think, you think about thinking. You question every motive, dissect every reaction, analyze why you analyze something in the first place. It sounds profound, but it's exhausting. You start doubting your own instincts, distrusting your emotions, and second-guessing your desires. You begin to feel detached from yourself, as if your consciousness is watching from a distance, taking notes on your existence. This constant self-monitoring creates a subtle tension, like living in front of an invisible audience that critiques your every move. Empathy adds another layer of complexity. Highly aware minds often feel emotions, not only their own, but everyone else's too. You absorb people's moods unconsciously. Sadness, insecurity, fear, all of it seeps into you like water through stone. You sense what others feel before they speak, and while that might sound noble, it becomes suffocating. Because not all pain is meant to be carried. You end up becoming a mirror for others' struggles, reflecting their emotions until you forget your own. It's a strange kind of compassion that drains rather than heals. You want to help, but sometimes you just end up drowning quietly in empathy. This constant awareness creates an internal noise that never shuts off. Even in silence, your mind buzzes with connections and interpretations. You lie awake replaying conversations, analyzing decisions that can't be changed, and imagining outcomes that will never happen. The past refuses to rest, the future refuses to wait, and the present feels too fragile to hold. There's always something unfinished in your thoughts. It's like having hundreds of open tabs in your brain, none of which you can close. You crave stillness, but your mind doesn't know how to stop searching for meaning. And beneath all this thinking, there's frustration, the frustration of unrealized potential. Intelligent people often feel like they're meant to do something great, but can't quite find what it is. The gap between what they know and what they can express becomes unbearable. They carry ideas too heavy for words, emotions too deep for conversation. The world feels too small, too distracted, too loud to hear what they're trying to say. So they retreat into themselves, building imaginary worlds in silence, creating universes no one else will ever see. This inner richness becomes both a refuge and a prison. The mind begins to crave simplicity, but it's forgotten how to find it. Even joy feels complicated, analyzed, categorized, dissected until it loses its magic. You might sit under a beautiful sky, but your thoughts race about time, mortality, or the physics of color instead of simply feeling the wind. You admire a song, but think about the psychology of nostalgia instead of letting the melody move you. You want to be present, but awareness constantly pulls you into observation. It's like watching life through a glass wall. You can see everything clearly, but you can't touch it. Over time, the overaware mind develops defense mechanisms. Some retreat into isolation to protect their energy. Others adopt a detached humor, turning insight into sarcasm to dull emotional pain. A few bury themselves in work, knowledge, or perfectionism, hoping that mastery will quiet the noise. But none of these truly work. The mind doesn't want escape. It wants integration. It wants to find a balance between seeing deeply and feeling freely. But that balance is fragile and requires something intelligent struggles with surrender. There's also an innocence buried beneath all that mental chaos, a quiet inner child that just wants peace. Beneath the intellect, beyond the analysis, there's still a part of you that simply wants to be held, understood, and accepted without being decoded. That part doesn't care about meaning or logic. It just wants warmth, presence, and silence. It's easy to forget that the mind is only one aspect of being. Intelligence shines like a bright flame, but the heart beats quietly beneath it, waiting to be heard again. When that child within you finally speaks, it doesn't use complex words. It says things like, "I'm tired," or "I just want to rest," or "I want to feel something real." And maybe that's the moment healing begins, when intelligence stops trying to outthink pain and starts listening to it. Awareness, after all, isn't supposed to be endless analysis. It's supposed to bring understanding. And understanding should eventually lead to compassion, not exhaustion. The psychology of the overaware mind is not madness. It's sensitivity turned inward. It's the cost of being deeply alive in a world that rewards numbness. But if you learn to make peace with your mind's intensity, if you stop fighting your own awareness, it can become something beautiful. It can become a guide, not a jailer. Because beneath the fatigue and overthinking lies a profound gift. The ability to feel the texture of existence with unbearable clarity. It hurts, yes, but it's also what makes life real. There comes a point when you start to realize that intelligence doesn't just shape how you think, it changes how you fit into the world. The more you understand, the less you belong. You begin to notice that most people talk not to communicate truth, but to feel comfortable. Conversations are often a performance, a way to confirm shared illusions rather than explore reality. You try to speak honestly, to question things, to dig deeper, but your words start creating distance instead of connection. The very act of thinking differently becomes a quiet rebellion. You become the misfit in the tribe, the one who sees from the edge, never quite inside. You watch how easily others bond over simplicity. A shared complaint, a trending topic, a shallow joke. It's not that you look down on them. It's that you can't fully join them. You crave meaning while others crave belonging, and that difference makes you an outsider. You try to meet people where they are, but your mind always drifts somewhere else, to questions that have no place in casual talk. Eventually, you learn to hide your depth just to survive the noise. You wear the mask of normalcy, but behind it, you feel like an observer pretending to be human. People often mistake your silence for arrogance. They think you're judging them when, in truth, you're just tired of pretending. The more intelligent or introspective you are, the more effort it takes to blend in. You start filtering your words, diluting your ideas, censoring your insights, because you know they'll only make others uncomfortable. When you simplify your truth, people like you more, but you like yourself less. Every small compromise chips away at authenticity. You laugh at jokes that don't amuse you, agree with ideas that don't convince you, just to avoid being the strange one again. The world doesn't always reward depth, it rewards relatability. And the deeper your perception, the less relatable you become. It's a paradox. The more you understand human nature, the harder it becomes to participate in it. You see through manipulation, insecurity, and social games so clearly that they lose their charm. You can't play along because you know too much about the rules. Others chase validation, power, and status, but you see how hollow those pursuits are. Still, even with this clarity, you feel a quiet envy, because ignorance at least allows belonging. There's also the unspoken rule of comfort. People don't want to hear about truth if it threatens their sense of order. When you challenge that order, you don't sound wise. You sound dangerous. Most minds are built for safety, not transformation. So when you question beliefs, you're not seen as thoughtful. You're seen as difficult. When you refuse to follow the script, people turn away. You learn that insight can be isolating and honesty can be mistaken for arrogance. Over time, you stop sharing what you really think, not because you've lost curiosity, but because you're tired of the silence that follows your words. You start to notice that society values conformity disguised as connection. Everyone wants to be unique until true individuality walks in a room. Then they call it weird. You sense that intelligence threatens balance, not because it's hostile, but because it exposes what others try to ignore. Your presence becomes a mirror, and mirrors make people uncomfortable. They don't hate you. They hate what they see reflected back. So they distance themselves, or worse, mock you to restore equilibrium. And yet, deep down, you understand them, because you too have felt the fear of seeing too much. There's a strange loneliness that comes from pretending to fit in. You play the part well. You smile, you nod, you make small talk, but your mind drifts elsewhere. It's like watching life from behind glass, always present, but never truly included. You might even start to question whether your intelligence is worth the isolation it brings. But then you remember the few moments when you've met someone who truly sees you, someone who listens not to respond, but to understand. Those connections are rare, almost sacred. They remind you that you're not crazy for wanting depth, just rare for noticing it. Still, isolation slowly becomes a kind of identity. You learn to find pride in being misunderstood. You start to think, if they can't see me, maybe I'm not meant to be seen by everyone. It's a comforting lie, but a necessary one. Solitude transforms into armor. You build your world within, filled with thoughts too delicate for public display. You spend more time in imagination than interaction. You start finding meaning not in approval, but in observation, watching, understanding, creating quietly. You become your own company, and though it feels lonely, it also feels honest. Sometimes, you wonder what life would be like if you were simpler, if you could laugh without analyzing, believe without questioning, love without hesitation. But simplicity is something you can't force. Once your mind learns to see deeply, it refuses to go blind again. So instead of chasing belonging, you begin to accept separation as part of your nature. You start valuing quality over quantity, one meaningful conversation over 100 hollow ones. The ache doesn't vanish, but it becomes manageable. It turns into a quiet strength, a reminder that solitude isn't always emptiness. Sometimes it's clarity. With time, you stop resenting the distance between you and others. You start seeing it as the natural gap between perception and pretense. You realize that most people aren't shallow. They're just trying to survive emotionally. Illusion is their protection, just as detachment is yours. You learn compassion for that. You stop expecting everyone to understand you and start focusing on understanding them. That's when something shifts. The loneliness doesn't disappear, but it stops feeling like punishment. It becomes a kind of freedom, the freedom to see without needing approval, to think without fear of exile. The social cost of thinking differently is real. It takes away ease, comfort, and sometimes even love. But it also gives something precious, the ability to live authentically. You stop performing, stop editing yourself for applause. You start valuing silence more than conversation, truth more than validation. You realize that belonging isn't about being liked. It's about being real, even when that realness costs you company. So you carry your solitude not as a wound, but as a crown. You may walk alone, but at least you walk honestly. And in a world addicted to pretending, that honesty, however isolating, is its own kind of peace. There comes a moment in every thinking person's life when awareness turns inward and becomes unbearable. You begin to ask questions that have no comforting answers about life, meaning, time, and the strange absurdity of existing at all. At first, intelligence feels like a ladder that will take you somewhere higher, somewhere clearer. But the higher you climb, the more the ground disappears beneath you. You start seeing how everything you believed in is built on shifting sand. Morality, identity, success, even love, all of it starts to look fragile. And instead of feeling free, you feel dizzy. Awareness becomes a spiral, pulling you deeper into thought until the edges between reality and reflection blur. The intelligent mind doesn't stop at what, it always asks why. And when you ask why enough times, the structure of meaning begins to crumble. Why do people chase happiness if it never lasts? Why do we work so hard to matter in a universe that will eventually forget us? Why do we suffer when there's no clear purpose behind it? These questions sound philosophical, but when they start living inside you, they stop feeling noble. They feel heavy, like a quiet gravity pulling your thoughts downward. You can't go back to shallow living once you've tasted the depth of uncertainty. You can't pretend things make sense when you've seen how fragile sense itself is. Certainty collapses, and with it, so does comfort. The world used to look organized, cause and effect, right and wrong, good and evil. But as you think deeper, those lines blur. You begin to see that truth is rarely pure, and morality is often situational. Every conviction you hold starts to dissolve under the weight of perspective. You understand too much to believe blindly, but not enough to find peace. It's like standing in a fog where every direction looks both right and wrong at once. You're too aware to be naive, but too human to stop searching for meaning. The result is a kind of quiet despair. Not dramatic, just persistent, like an ache that never fully fades. You start to see how existence is built on paradox. The more you seek meaning, the more you realize how fragile it is. Everything we do, work, relationships, art, feels like an attempt to distract ourselves from a void. You see it in others too, the desperate attempt to fill silence with noise, to give their days a shape that feels significant. But once you see through it, you can't unsee it. The illusions that held life together start falling apart, and in their absence, even joy feels temporary. It's not that life loses value, it just loses clarity. You understand too much to believe in simple stories, and that understanding isolates you from the comfort of faith that others still possess. There's also the paradox of observation. The more you analyze life, the less you participate in it. You become the observer, always one step removed from experience. When others dance, you think about rhythm. When they fall in love, you analyze the psychology of attachment. When they laugh, you think about the social function of humor. It's not that you don't feel, it's that your awareness interrupts feeling before it can flow naturally. You're stuck between living and understanding, trapped in the observer's paradox, seeing everything, touching nothing. It's a kind of spiritual paralysis that intelligence often brings. This quiet despair deepens when you realize that understanding doesn't heal. You thought wisdom would bring peace, but it only brings clarity, and clarity can be cruel. You see why people lie to themselves, why they chase distractions, why they cling to illusions of control. You envy them sometimes, not for their ignorance, but for their ability to stay anchored in meaning. You, on the other hand, drift. You exist between worlds, too aware for blind faith, too emotional for pure logic. You feel like a ghost haunting your own thoughts, watching life from a distance while longing to re-enter it. And yet, beneath that ache, something begins to shift. The more you accept the absurdity of existence, the lighter it feels. When you stop demanding meaning, moments start feeling enough on their own. A cup of tea, a piece of music, a small act of kindness. These things start to matter precisely because they are fleeting. You start to see that maybe the point of intelligence isn't to solve existence, but to experience it consciously. Maybe the mind's role isn't to build permanent truths, but to appreciate impermanent beauty. You start learning to live with open questions instead of final answers. That realization doesn't erase the pain, but it transforms it. The existential spiral stops being a fall and becomes a dance. You learn to coexist with uncertainty, to let paradox breathe without needing resolution. You begin to understand that meaning is not something to be found, but something to be made, moment by moment, choice by choice. You start creating small meanings instead of chasing one ultimate truth. You write, you listen, you connect, you forgive, not because it solves the void, but because it gives light to it. Intelligence, once your tormentor, becomes your instrument. With time, you stop trying to escape your mind. You start befriending it. You learn to let your thoughts come and go like weather, to treat questions like visitors instead of enemies. You realize that maybe consciousness isn't a curse, it's an invitation. To see deeply, to feel deeply, to live knowing that nothing lasts, and to love life anyway. That's the quiet freedom that grows after despair, the kind of peace that doesn't depend on certainty. It's fragile but real. So the spiral continues, but now you move through it differently. You stop fighting to climb out and start learning to flow with it. The pain of awareness becomes the rhythm of your understanding. The questions never stop, but they stop scaring you. You begin to see that the very mystery that once broke you is also what makes life beautiful. To think deeply is to suffer, yes, but it's also to awaken. And in that awakening, even the chaos begins to feel sacred. There comes a quiet moment when the mind grows weary of itself. After years of dissecting every thought and emotion, you begin to realize that intelligence, without peace, is exhausting. You try to think your way out of pain, but all that thinking only made the pain clearer. You saw every hidden motive, every fragile truth, every lie people tell themselves to stay comfortable. And instead of feeling wise, you felt lonely. You understood too much and felt too little. But eventually, you reach a breaking point, not of despair, but of surrender. You stop trying to escape your awareness. You stop trying to find meaning in everything. You simply let things be what they are. In that surrender, a strange calm begins to grow. It's not the kind of peace you can force. It's the peace that arrives when you stop fighting. You start to see that maybe the goal was never to master life, but to trust it. You've spent years analyzing emotions instead of feeling them. Now, you let them flow without judgment. Sadness no longer feels like a problem to solve. It feels like proof that you're alive. You start to realize that pain isn't always an error. Sometimes it's just depth, the price of awareness. The mind, once restless, begins to soften. You no longer chase answers. You no longer try to make sense of every uncertainty. You understand that mystery isn't a flaw in the system. It's part of what makes existence meaningful. You begin to live less like a scientist and more like a poet, still curious, but no longer desperate to define everything. You start noticing small things, the quiet rhythm of breathing, the way sunlight moves through your room, the subtle peace that comes from silence. They were always there, but your thoughts were too loud to notice them. You also start seeing people differently. The same world that once looked shallow now looks human. You realize that everyone carries their own unseen battle, their own silent chaos. Not everyone has the language for their pain. Some hide it behind laughter, others behind pride. You stop judging them. You stop feeling superior for noticing what others ignore. Instead, you feel compassion. You start to see intelligence not as separation, but as connection, the ability to understand without condemning. You discover that empathy, not analysis, is the real expression of awareness. Solitude becomes less painful, too. What once felt like exile starts to feel like clarity. Being alone no longer means being lost. It means having space to listen, not just to your thoughts, but to your soul. You begin to enjoy quiet moments that used to scare you. There's peace in not needing distraction, in simply existing without performing. The silence that once hurt now heals. You realize that you don't always need company to feel whole. Sometimes solitude is how the mind remembers itself. The pain of intelligence starts to fade, not because life becomes easier, but because you stop expecting it to be easy. You understand that suffering isn't always a sign of something wrong. Sometimes it's a doorway to understanding. You stop trying to escape the duality of life, joy and sorrow, clarity and confusion, hope and despair. You start to see that peace doesn't mean escaping contrast. It means embracing it. You no longer demand perfection from life. You simply meet it as it comes, raw, imperfect, real. Small joys return quietly. You find meaning in moments that require no explanation. The laughter of a friend, the smell of rain, the sound of distant traffic at night. These things become sacred not because they are rare, but because you finally notice them. You stop chasing grand purposes and start living simply. You begin to feel lightness again, the kind that comes when you stop carrying the need to understand everything. You learn to forgive yourself for overthinking, for isolating, for being too aware in a world that runs on distraction. You forgive your mind for trying too hard to protect you, and your heart for still feeling too much. You understand now that your depth was never the problem. Your resistance to it was. So you stop resisting. You let your thoughts exist without fear, your emotions without explanation. You allow yourself to be complex and calm at once. In the end, you see that the pain of intelligence was never a curse. It was a teacher, one that showed you what false peace looks like so you could find a real one. It taught you that awareness without acceptance leads to suffering, but awareness with surrender leads to freedom. You no longer wish to escape your mind. You wish to live peacefully within it. You no longer wish to unsee the truth. You wish to see it with gentleness. The same mind that once overanalyzed everything now understands the simplest truth, that life is not meant to be solved, only lived. And when you finally stop trying to think your way into peace, peace quietly finds you.